Just to get through the funny little things, this is a presentation by the Blueberry Patch Ink Tank, hosted by Neptune Grill. My name is Ian O'Hara, and our fearless leader, Martha MUZZIE, and the great Kurt Thompson on vibes. No joke. Real serious crowd here. Yeah. Okay, well then, no jokes today. I've just been released from the nut house, so I've forgotten all of my materials. So I'm using something that I've never used before. No drum roll either. Okay, that's fine. I'm using technology. I'm a notebook guy. And I have probably a good, 15 pages of notes on T.S. Eliot, and I've misplaced my notes, as well as my introduction. So I'm going to read from something I've never used before, which is this wonderful little machine here. And hopefully it's accurate. And I'll try to remember as much as I can from what I had written down over 6-7 years ago. Anyway, so our topic today is T.S. Eliot. Why did we choose him? We're following a progression of modernists, and Peter and myself and Martha found that T.S. Eliot maybe was the second to the top of the modernist writers. And so we decided we chose him. Now, of course, T.S. Eliot was born Thomas Stearns Eliot in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri. And what is his family's claim to fame? Anybody know? No? Boy, this is a hard crowd. Gee whiz. You didn't realize it was going to be interactive, did you, Peter?
Other than they're originally from New England.
Yes, they're from New England. These are founders of American Unitarianism. And the amazing thing about T.S. Eliot is he denounced his American citizenship and his foundations of Unitarianism to become an Anglican. Not just an Anglican, but an Englishman, which is fundamentally the opposite of Unitarianism, American Unitarianism. So I skipped ahead a little bit. He was raised in St. Louis, Missouri. His father founded the Eliot Church there, which is still a great church of right now 650 people strong. The ideas of progressivism always was an undertone in his childhood. Suffrage and latter abolition. Remember, we fought a civil war for what? Right. And there was still things going on. I mean, obviously, we just settled something this past month, maybe to finalize that. So his early childhood was based heavily on education, and he was really well read. By the time he was 12, he had written an early child memoir. It hasn't been ever published, but there are notes at the Harvard Library. If you're ever interested in looking it up, and just the day-to-day progressions of what he did as a young man. Now, being an Eliot, he was related to a number of leading members of American society. And he found himself qualifying what they did. as a young man, and essentially writing prose about unnamed kin who did amazing things. And so you'll see in his early works poetry about aunts and uncles and cousins. I don't know if that was necessarily intentional or if the titles were necessarily intentional, but that was what existed for him at that particular point in time within his circle. Now, his mother, Charlotte, who was a Stearns, he was named after his maternal grandfather, she was very early on in American social work, which of course today, I don't know who would choose that path. It's got to be something that's given by God to make that choice in your life. But she possessed that ability. And his mother would come home with just dreary concepts about it. And what he did is he looked at that really from an exclusively spiritual direction, which is unusual for a young man. And said, well, maybe these families, these children, are lost because they don't have a base of fundamental morality. So remember, this pushes on into his adulthood and into his later writings. So, you know, these are the several factors. His family, his physical limitations due to several hernia issues, the seeking of the concept of Tom Sawyer. I mean, he was mesmerized by Mark Twain. And any visit that Mark Twain had to St. Louis, he was there. And so there was a bond. And I think all of these things are what developed, I mean, his early development in writing. So he would occasionally visit Boston and meet up with a lot of these friends and family, and he found himself sitting outside. He was a gazer. He was an individual who would take in what was around him, and it was not necessarily what was around him in the physical sense, but what was around him in the personalities that sat at those tables or sat with him. And this is really part of the modernist structure, the larger cultural modernist structure. And, you know, of course, this would bring him into the concepts of science and psychology as well. So he graduated from Smith Academy. By the time he graduated from Smith Academy, he had probably up to 25 to 30 short stories, which at that point in time hadn't been published. And I don't believe any of them have been published as of yet, but they're part of the library, early library. The other thing that was interesting about him is that he was interesting in critiquing other people's work, which was unusual. And it wasn't just anybody's work. It was everybody's work. Men of great letters and men who were 30, 40 years his senior, who had been doing it for quite a bit of time. He entered Harvard, graduated with his A.B., and then with his and then with his bachelor's degree. excuse me, I failed to mention he attended Milton Academy in Milton, Mass. The most important thing about Milton, Mass was his friendship with Schofield Thayer. And Schofield Thayer had something that Tom Eliot didn't have, which was an abundance of a lot of money. Eliot lived on a very small stipend, but Schofield Thayer had an incredible amount of money, and he really was the guy who introduced him to everybody who was anybody at that particular point in time, culturally and socially, and also gave him the ability to have his stories and have his lectures posted and published. Now, this is at a period of time when the Athenaeums were at the lead of the lecture series, and he produced his very first lecture in 1906 at the Boston Athenaeum, and then repeated that same lecture at the Providence Athenaeum, and gave him his foothold in American modernism. Let's see, in 1904, well, yeah, he was elected to write for the Harvard Review, and then the Harvard Advocate, and several journals. And I believe, let's see, here we go. Now, my dates may be a little off, but he graduated in 1909, and he graduated in 1909 with his critique of symbolism in the movement of literature. And, you know, he worked as a philosophy assistant at Harvard from 1909 to 1910, and he realized that philosophy and literature were waning and dying in America. That was his quote. So what did he do? He moved to Paris. And he studied at the Sorbonne, and then became an adjunct member of their faculty. And he became really interested in Bergson's and Fournier's theories and philosophies of life and of literature. And then decided, well, I'm going to go to Oxford and see what I can do there. Now, I'm going to stop because we have a couple of early writings of about this time.
Hi, everybody, I'm Martha, and I've got a few, they're short poems that he wrote about the time that he was at Harvard, and they were published a couple of years later, I believe, around the time that he went to Oxford and was in England. And as Ian said, some of them are about relatives or titled that way anyway, and perhaps his critique on them, because he did grow up privileged and in a very strict religious background. And what comes to me through some of his work is that he is a sit-back observer of people, of places and things, and what he observes is a little interesting and not what you and I might just look at somebody's like, oh, well, that's whatever. He stands back and gives some interesting perspective, or his own perspective on things. This one is called Aunt Helen. It says, Miss Helen Slingsby was my maiden aunt and lived in a small house near a fashionable square, cared for by servants to the number of 4. Now when she died, there was silence in heaven and silence at her end of the street. The shutters were drawn and the undertaker wiped his feet. He was aware of this sort of thing had occurred before. The dogs were handsomely provided for. But shortly afterwards, the parrot died too. The Dresden clock continued ticking on the mantelpiece, and the footman sat upon the dining room table, holding the second housemaid on his knees, who had always been so very careful while her mistress lived. And this one is called Cousin Nancy. Miss Nancy Ellicott strode across the hills and broke them, rode across the hills and broke them, the barren New England hills, riding to hounds over the cow pasture. Miss Nancy Ellicott smoked and danced all modern dances, and her aunts were not quite sure how they felt about it, but they knew it was modern. Upon the glazed shelves kept watch Matthew and Waldo, guardians of the faith, the army of the unaltered law. There's the other relatives looking down. And here's an observation. I think this is from his time in Boston. He would walk about the streets. He was a student during the day, and he would walk about the streets in the evenings and his off time and observe what other people were doing, and kind of with a little bit of an alien eye sometimes, I think. Anyway, is what comes through to me. This one's called Morning at the Window. They're rattling breakfast plates in basement kitchens. And along the trampled edges of the street, I am aware of the damp souls of housemaids sprouting despondently at area gates. The brown waves of fog tossed upon me, twisted faces from the bottom of the street, and tear from a passerby with muddy skirts, an aimless smile that hovers in the air and vanishes along the level of the roofs. And I'm going to show you one more. Okay. This one is called Rhapsody on a Windy Night. And it was published in 1915, but I believe it was written there again during his time at Harvard and published a little later. 12 o'clock. Along the reaches of the street, held in lunar synthesis, whispering lunar incarnations dissolve the floors of memory and all its clear relations, its divisions, its precisions. Every street lamp that I pass beats like a fatalistic drum, and through the spaces of the dark, midnight shakes a memory as a madman shakes a dead geranium. 1:30. The street lamp sputtered. The street lamp muttered. The street lamp said, "Regard that woman who hesitates towards you in the light of the door which opens on her like a grin. You see the border of her skirt is torn and stained with sand, and you see the corner of her eye twist like a crooked pin." The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things. A twisted branch upon the beach, eaten smooth and polished as if the world gave up its secret of its skeleton, stiff and white. A broken spring in a factory yard. Rust that clings to the form that the strength has left, hard and curled and ready to snap. 2:30, the street lamp said. Remark the cat which flattens itself in the gutter, slips out its tongue and devours a morsel of rancid butter. So the hand of a child, automatic, slipped out and pocketed a toy that was running along the quay. I could see nothing behind the child's eye. I have seen eyes in the street, trying to peer through lighted shutters, and a crab one afternoon in a pool, an old crab with barnacles on its back, gripping the end of a stick which I held him on. 3:30, the lamp sputtered. The lamp muttered in dark. The lamp hummed. Regard the moon. She winks a feeble eye. She smiles into corners. She smooths the hair of the grass. The moon has lost her memory. A washed-out smallpox cracked her face. Her hand twisted a paper rose. Twists a paper rose. Sorry. The smells of dust and eau de cologne. She is alone. With all the old nocturnal smells that cross and cross across her brain. The reminiscence comes of sunless dry geraniums and dust in crevices. Smells of chestnuts in the streets and female smells in shuttered rooms. and cigarettes in corridors, and cocktail smells in bars. The lamp says 4 o'clock. Here is the number on the door. Memory, you have the key. The little lamp spreads a ring on the stair. Mount, the bed is open. The toothbrush hangs on the wall. Put your shoes at the door. Sleep prepares for life. The last twist of the knife. So that's a nighttime excursion. All right, well, those are some of his early ones. Ian, maybe you can give us a little more.